The ice-crusted rains bit into Hauptmann Friedrich Weber's hands as he stood beside his battery commander, watching 8 Panzerskimmel, gray artillery horses, strain against their traces. The animals' breath came in great billowing clouds as they hauled the 7.5-centimeter field gun through knee-deep snow somewhere east of Zhytomyr. Behind them, 2 kilometers down the frozen road, sat 3 pristine SD, KFC, 7 half-tracks, Germany's pride of mechanized artillery towing vehicles, utterly useless without the fuel that hadn't arrived in 6 days. It was January 19, 1944, and the German army's most closely guarded secret was written in hoof prints across the Eastern Front. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Weber had joined the Wehrmacht in 1938 believing he would command a modern, mechanized force. The recruitment films showed endless columns of tanks, half-tracks, and motorized infantry sweeping across Europe with industrial precision. The propaganda ministry's newsreels emphasized Germany's technological superiority, the Blitzkrieg that had conquered Poland in weeks, France in months. Every image reinforced the same message: Germany fought a modern war with modern weapons, leaving behind the antiquated methods of the previous generation. Horses, the films suggested, belonged to the primitive armies Germany had defeated. The Polish cavalry charging German tanks had become a symbol of obsolete thinking crushed beneath the tracks of progress. The reality Weber now faced contradicted everything those films had promised. The horses straining before him weren't a temporary expedient or a backup plan. They were the primary logistics system of the Wehrmacht, and they always had been. Even at the height of Blitzkrieg's success in 1940 and 1941, over 80% of the German army moved on foot or hoof. Of the roughly 2.7 million horses Germany possessed at the war's beginning, the Wehrmacht had already lost over 1 million on the Eastern Front alone. The replacement rate couldn't keep pace. German factories could produce Panthers and Tigers, but they couldn't produce petroleum, and without petroleum, the most advanced tank was merely an expensive pillbox. The fuel crisis hadn't materialized suddenly. It had been building since 1941 when Germany failed to capture the Soviet oil fields at Baku. Romania provided what it could, about 5 to 6 million tons annually, but Germany consumed petroleum far faster than its allies could supply it. Synthetic fuel plants, built at enormous expense using the Fischer-Tropsch process, produced roughly 4 million tons per year, but this barely met the Luftwaffe's needs. The Kriegsmarine consumed its share. What remained had to be rationed among millions of vehicles, generators, and machines spread across a front stretching from Norway to North Africa. By late 1943, the arithmetic of German logistics had become catastrophic. A single panzer division required approximately 300 cubic meters of fuel per day of combat operations. An infantry division, despite its reliance on horses, still needed 30 cubic meters daily for its support vehicles, generators, and motorcycles. With over 300 divisions deployed across multiple fronts, Germany's daily petroleum consumption exceeded its production and importation capacity by a widening margin. The gap was filled by depleting strategic reserves that dwindled month by month. Weber remembered the exact moment he understood the depth of the crisis. It came not through official channels or command briefings, but through a casual conversation with Oberst Dietrich Manstein, his regimental commander, over ersatz coffee in a frozen dugout near Kirovograd. Manstein had been sifting through supply requisitions, his face drawn with fatigue that went beyond mere sleeplessness. "Do you know what Berlin allocated us this month for vehicle fuel?" he'd asked without looking up. 60% of our documented minimum operational requirement. And we received 45% of that allocation. The trains carrying our fuel were diverted to support a panzer corps that needed it more desperately than we do. The Oberst had set down the papers and met Weber's eyes. The entire Eastern Front is receiving approximately 60% of its fuel requirements. The arithmetic doesn't work, Friedrich. It never did. We invaded the Soviet Union with a logistics tale built for a 6-month campaign. We're now in year 3. Every kilometer we advance stretches our supply lines further beyond our capacity to maintain them. Every liter of fuel burned driving east is a liter we don't have for the retreat west. That conversation had occurred in November. Now, 2 months later, the 45% allocation had become 30%. Then 20%. Now, for Weber's artillery battery, it had become 0. The half-track sat silent, conserving the dregs remaining in their tanks for an emergency that High Command insisted was imminent. Weber suspected the emergency would never come, or rather, that it had already arrived and was now simply their permanent condition. The horses reached the crest of the hill, and Weber could see the forward assembly area where his battery would deploy. Around him, the landscape told the same story his own unit embodied. Everywhere, German forces moved as their grandfathers had in the First World War, men on foot, equipment on wagons, artillery behind horse teams. The occasional vehicle that rumbled past stood out precisely because it was exceptional. The panzers and half-tracks that appeared in newsreels represented a tiny fraction of German combat power, a fraction that grew smaller each month as petroleum supplies dwindled and irreplaceable vehicles succumbed to mechanical failure without spare parts or lubricants. The German army had entered the war with approximately 120,000 motor vehicles. It required approximately 150,000 replacement vehicles annually to maintain that fleet against normal attrition. German industry produced nowhere near that number. In 1943, total production of all military vehicles, trucks, half-tracks, armored cars, everything, came to roughly 75,000 units. Meanwhile, German forces lost or wore out approximately 130,000 vehicles. The mathematics were inexorable. The mechanized force shown in propaganda films was being replaced by horses, bicycles, and boot leather. What made the situation truly desperate was that Germany's enemies suffered no such constraints. Soviet production of trucks, supported by tens of thousands of American Studebakers and Dodges arriving through Lend-Lease, had created a Red Army far more mobile than its German counterpart. American forces in Italy and, soon, in France, would possess effectively unlimited petroleum supplies shipped from Texas and Venezuela. The Germans called it fighting against the oil well. Against an enemy that could fuel unlimited mobility, Germany's horse-drawn logistics represented a return not merely to the previous war, but to the wars before that. Weber had seen the intelligence reports. A single American infantry division possessed over 2,000 trucks, roughly the same number assigned to an entire German corps of 3 divisions. An American armored division could sustain operations at distances that would leave German panzer divisions immobilized for lack of fuel. The disparity wasn't merely quantitative, it was categorical. Germany was fighting an industrial war with a pre-industrial logistics system, and everyone from Oberkommando to General Feldmarschall understood the implications, even if speaking them aloud bordered on defeatism. The horses finally halted at the assembly area, their flanks steaming despite the cold. Weber's gun crews began the familiar process of unhitching the pieces and preparing them for action. In the distance, the rumble of Soviet artillery reminded him why they were here. The Red Army was pushing westward with methodical inevitability, and Weber's battery would attempt to slow them, not stop them, merely slow them, until the fuel situation improved or the front collapsed. At this point, Weber suspected the second would arrive before the first. He thought about the conversations at regimental headquarters, the careful euphemisms commanders used to describe their situation. They spoke of temporary transportation difficulties and adjusted logistics priorities and alternative movement solutions. No one said what everyone knew: Germany was running out of petroleum, and without petroleum, it was losing the capacity to wage modern war. The horses straining in their traces weren't a backup plan. They were Germany's admission that the mechanized warfare it had pioneered was beyond its industrial capacity to sustain. That evening, as Weber reviewed the battery's readiness reports by candlelight, another commodity in short supply, a motorcycle courier arrived with orders from division headquarters. The typed directive was brief and bureaucratic, its language sterile enough to disguise desperation. All artillery units were to prioritize conservation of motor fuel for critical operational movements only. Horse-drawn transportation was to be considered the primary logistics solution for routine battery positioning and ammunition supply. Commanders were instructed to requisition additional draft animals through local agricultural procurement when possible. Weber read between the lines with practiced skill. Local agricultural procurement meant confiscation from Ukrainian farms already stripped bare by years of German and Soviet requisitions. Primary logistics solution meant permanent, not temporary. Critical operational movements only meant the half-tracks would likely never move again until they were destroyed or abandoned in retreat. The directive concluded with a line that would have been darkly amusing if it weren't so tragic. Units were reminded to maintain the highest standards of military bearing and operational readiness regardless of transportation methodology employed. He thought about the newsreels still being shown in German cinemas, the ones that portrayed Wehrmacht forces as an unstoppable mechanized juggernaut. He wondered what the civilians watching those films would think if they could see this reality: 8 freezing horses hauling artillery through snow while perfectly functional half-tracks sat idle for lack of fuel. Would they understand that Germany was losing not because its soldiers lacked courage or its engineers lacked ingenuity, but because it had entered an industrial war without the industrial resources to sustain it? The next morning brought fresh snow and fresh orders. The battery would displace 12 kilometers west, not to attack, but to establish new defensive positions. The retreat continued, 1 frozen kilometer at a time, while somewhere far behind the lines, High Command drafted plans for offensives that would require petroleum Germany no longer possessed. Weber gave the order to hitch the horses and watched his men work with the exhausted efficiency of soldiers who had learned to expect nothing but what stood immediately before them. As the column formed, Weber noticed Oberst Manstein approaching on horseback, the commander's staff car having joined the ranks of immobilized vehicles. The Oberst drew alongside without speaking, both men watching the horses lean into their harnesses. The fuel allocation came through for next month, Manstein said finally, his voice flat. 15% of minimum operational requirements. Weber nodded, unsurprised. 15%, 10%, 5%, the numbers no longer mattered. They had crossed into a realm where mathematics gave way to simple scarcity. Berlin has requested a detailed report on our implementation of alternative logistics solutions, Manstein continued, a bitter edge creeping into his tone. They want us to document our success in maintaining operational capability with reduced petroleum allocations. I suspect they intend to present it as a model for other units. What should I tell them? Weber asked. Manstein was quiet for a long moment, watching snow gather on his horse's mane. Tell them the truth, he said finally. Tell them we're fighting the 1940s with the logistics of 1870. Tell them every horse we lose is irreplaceable, every vehicle we abandon is gone forever, every liter of fuel we don't receive is ground we can't defend. Tell them. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Tell them that Germany can build the finest tanks in the world, but it cannot build petroleum, and without petroleum, those tanks are sculptures of steel rather than instruments of war. They won't want to hear that, Herr Oberst. No, Manstein agreed. They'll want to hear that morale remains high, that alternative solutions are proving effective, that the fighting spirit of the German soldier compensates for material shortfalls. They'll want me to write that horses are actually superior for winter warfare, that mechanization was always overrated, that we're simply returning to time-tested methods. He gathered his reins. But you asked what I should tell them, not what they want to hear. Those are increasingly different things. The column began to move, horses straining against artillery pieces while the half-tracks remained behind, already fading into drifting snow. Weber walked beside his section, feeling the cold penetrate his coat, watching the rhythmic plod of hooves in snow. Somewhere ahead lay the next defensive line, and beyond that, another, and another, an endless series of fallbacks masked in operational language that couldn't disguise the fundamental reality. Germany was running out of time, space, and fuel, and not necessarily in that order. The displacement westward took 3 days that should have required 8 hours. The horses, underfed and overworked, managed perhaps 15 kilometers on a good day. Weber's battery covered the distance in stages, stopping frequently to rest the animals and clear snow from the frozen road. Each halt meant another hour vulnerable to Soviet reconnaissance aircraft, another hour when enemy artillery might find them immobile and exposed. The half-tracks they'd left behind could have completed the journey in a single night movement, but the half-tracks required fuel that existed only in allocation tables and optimistic projections from the Reichsministerium. Weber spent those 3 days learning truths about horse logistics that no military academy had taught him. He learned that a working draft horse required roughly 10 kilograms of fodder daily, oats, hay, or whatever vegetation could be found or confiscated. His battery's 48 horses consumed nearly half a ton of feed every day, and finding that feed in Ukraine's stripped countryside proved nearly as challenging as obtaining petroleum. He learned that horses, unlike trucks, couldn't work around the clock. They needed rest, water, veterinary care. A truck with mechanical problems might be abandoned. A horse with lameness created a moral calculus that troubled even hardened soldiers. He learned, too, that the horses slowed everything. Artillery batteries that once displaced in hours now required days. Ammunition that could have been stockpiled in a single motorized convoy now arrived in dribs and drabs as horse-drawn wagons made repeated journeys. The entire tempo of warfare changed when measured in hoofbeats rather than engine revolutions. Modern war required speed, concentration of force, rapid exploitation of opportunities. Horse-drawn logistics provided none of these. It provided only grinding endurance and the grim mathematics of attrition. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The new defensive position sat astride a low ridge overlooking frozen farmland that stretched toward the Soviet lines 8 kilometers distant. Weber's guns were emplaced by February 2nd, their fields of fire carefully plotted, ammunition stocks arranged in snow-covered dumps behind each piece. The position was professionally prepared, tactically sound, and ultimately irrelevant. Everyone understood they would hold it for days or perhaps weeks before orders came to displace further west. The only question was whether the retreat would be orderly or catastrophic, and the answer to that question increasingly depended on factors far beyond any individual battery commander's control. On February 7, 1944, Weber received a document that would crystallize his understanding of Germany's situation with mathematical precision. It arrived via the same motorcycle courier system that had become the Wehrmacht's primary communications method as radio batteries grew scarce and telegraph wires were cut by partisan activity. The document was a logistics assessment prepared by the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, High Command, analyzing the Eastern Front's transportation requirements versus available capacity. Weber read it twice, certain he had misunderstood. He had not. The assessment laid out Germany's logistics crisis with bureaucratic frankness that felt almost transgressive given the propaganda's relentless optimism. According to OKW calculations, maintaining defensive operations on the Eastern Front required transporting approximately 30,000 tons of supplies daily, ammunition, fuel, food, equipment, everything an army needed to function. Germany's available rail capacity, after Soviet bombing and partisan sabotage, could move roughly 18,000 tons daily. That left a 12,000-ton deficit that had to be made up through motor transport. But motor transport required fuel, and fuel was precisely what Germany lacked. Even if every truck on the Eastern Front operated at full capacity, which none could, given mechanical breakdowns and parts shortages, they could move perhaps 4,000 additional tons daily. That still left an 8,000-ton gap between what the front required and what German logistics could deliver. The gap was being filled, the document stated with chilling understatement, through reduction of ammunition stocks, rationing of fuel to essential vehicles only, and increased reliance on horse-drawn transport for tactical movements. The document included a statistical appendix that Weber found himself reading multiple times, as though repetition might alter the numbers. The Wehrmacht currently possessed approximately 1.1 million horses on the Eastern Front. Losses to combat, overwork, disease, and malnutrition averaged 6,000 animals weekly. Replacement deliveries from Germany and occupied territories averaged 3,000 weekly. The mathematics projected total collapse of horse-based logistics within 16 to 20 months unless, and here the document's language became carefully conditional, unless consumption rates decreased or replacement rates increased substantially. Neither seemed likely. Germany had already confiscated nearly every suitable horse from occupied territories. The breeding farms in Germany itself were producing at maximum capacity, but horses required years to mature, not months. Young animals pressed into service before proper training often died within weeks from injury or stress. Older animals, worked beyond their physical limits, succumbed to heart failure or simple exhaustion. The veterinary corps, stretched impossibly thin, could save some but not most. Every week, the total herd shrank, and with it shrank the Wehrmacht's ability to move, fight, or survive. What made the document truly remarkable was its source. This was not partisan propaganda or defeatist rumor. This was Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Army High Command, presenting facts to senior officers with sufficient clearance to receive them. The document's classification marking, Geheime Kommandosake, secret command matter, indicated it was intended only for division-level commanders and above. Weber suspected Oberst Manstein had shared it precisely because he believed his subordinate officers needed to understand the reality behind the euphemisms. That same week brought evidence that the crisis extended beyond mere statistics. Orders arrived redistributing horses across the division based on operational priority. Weber's artillery battery lost 8 animals to an infantry regiment whose supply wagons had been immobilized when their remaining horses died. The infantry, in turn, had surrendered horses to a Panzergrenadier battalion whose half-tracks sat immobile for lack of fuel. The entire division was engaged in a zero-sum game, moving horses from unit to unit like pieces on a board where every move weakened someone. The requisition order included instructions for local procurement of replacement draft animals. Weber understood immediately what this meant. The euphemism translated to confiscation from whatever Ukrainian farms still possessed livestock. Never mind that these animals might be the difference between a farming family surviving winter or starving. Never mind that taking horses from agriculture would reduce food production in occupied territories already teetering on famine. The Wehrmacht needed horses, and the needs of the Wehrmacht superseded all other considerations. Weber accompanied the procurement detail himself, unable to delegate what felt increasingly like organized theft. The farm they visited sat 3 kilometers behind the lines, a cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by frozen fields. An old man and 2 women, his daughters, perhaps, or daughters-in-law, Weber didn't ask, emerged as the trucks arrived. They knew why German soldiers had come. This wasn't the first procurement visit they'd endured. The old man spoke Ukrainian, which Weber's interpreter translated into German. The family had 2 horses, both elderly. They needed the animals to plow in spring, to bring in hay, to survive. Without them, the farm couldn't function. Weber listened, knowing his response was predetermined. The Wehrmacht needed the horses more than this family did. That was the calculus that governed requisitions. He authorized the confiscation, watched his men lead the animals away, and pretended not to see the old man's face. On the truck ride back, his interpreter, a Volksdeutsch from Bessarabia who spoke both languages, said quietly, "They'll starve, Herr Hauptmann. Without those horses, that farm produces nothing." Weber nodded. He knew. "How many farms have we visited?" 17 in the past month, sir." "And how many could survive without their horses?" The interpreter was silent for a moment. "None, sir." That night, Weber added another entry to his private journal, a practice he maintained despite regulations against documenting pessimistic assessments. He wrote, "We are stealing horses from farmers who will starve without them, to pull artillery that we cannot adequately supply with ammunition, to fight a war we cannot logistically sustain." The mathematics of defeat are written in every requisition order, every fuel allocation, every horse that dies in harness. High Command publishes assessments acknowledging we cannot maintain current operations, then issues orders demanding we do exactly that. We have entered a realm where documentation contradicts directives, where classified reports admit impossible situations that official communiques deny. The war continues not because we can win, but because stopping requires acknowledging we cannot. February became March, and the promised spring offensive, the one that would stabilize the front and reverse German fortunes, failed to materialize. It couldn't. The offensive existed in planning documents and motivational speeches, but it required fuel allocations that existed only on paper. Panzer divisions designated for the attack sat immobilized, their tanks preserved for a push that receded further into the future with each passing week. Infantry divisions that should have been refitting and re-equipping instead remained in line, their positions thinning as casualties mounted and replacements arrived in insufficient numbers. On March 19, Weber attended a divisional staff meeting where the operations officer presented the plan for a limited counterattack designed to disrupt Soviet preparations for their own offensive. The plan was professionally conceived, tactically sound, and logistically impossible. It required concentrating 3 infantry divisions and 1 panzer division at a specific point, then executing a rapid penetration of Soviet lines followed by encirclement of 2 enemy rifle divisions. The operations officer described the maneuver with confidence, using colored pins on a map to show unit movements. When he finished, there was silence. Finally, the divisional commander, General Major Klaus Seidman, a veteran of Poland, France, and 3 years in Russia, spoke. "This is an excellent plan," Seidman said carefully. "It would likely succeed if we could execute it." "Can we execute it?" The operations officer hesitated. "Herr General, the plan meets all doctrinal requirements for—" "I didn't ask about doctrine," Seidman interrupted. "I asked if we can execute it. Can the Panzer Division move to the assembly area?" A pause. "With current fuel allocations, partial movement would be possible, Herr General." "Partial." "Perhaps 60% of the division's armor could reach the assembly area. The remainder would need to be towed or left in place." Seidman nodded slowly. "And the infantry divisions? Can they march to their positions carrying adequate ammunition?" Another pause. "Supply wagons would need to make multiple trips, Herr General. Horse-drawn transport limits the tonnage per." "How long?" Seidman cut in. "How long to position 3 divisions and ensure they have the ammunition for a sustained attack?" The operations officer consulted his notes. "Accounting for horse-drawn transport rates and current road conditions, 11 to 14 days, Herr General." 11 to 14 days, Seidman repeated. "And Soviet reconnaissance? How long before they identify our concentration?" "Intelligence estimates they would detect major troop movements within 48 to 72 hours. So we need 2 weeks to assemble forces for a surprise attack that the enemy will detect within 3 days." Seidman's voice remained level, almost gentle. "Gentlemen, this is not a plan. This is a fantasy written by staff officers who believe logistics can be wished into existence." The room remained silent. No one challenged the general's assessment because everyone present understood its truth. The gap between what doctrine demanded and what logistics could deliver had become unbridgeable. Germany was planning offensives with armies that could barely sustain defensive operations, conceiving maneuvers that required mobility the Wehrmacht no longer possessed. Seidman continued, his tone still measured but edged with something harder. "I have received 3 directives this month from Army Group South. Each one demands aggressive action to disrupt Soviet preparations. Each one assumes fuel allocations we are not receiving and will not receive. Each one ignores the logistical assessments we submit weekly documenting our actual capabilities." He paused, looking at the map with its optimistic colored pins. "I will not sacrifice this division executing a plan that cannot succeed because Berlin refuses to acknowledge reality." Weber watched the operations officer's face carefully. The man was young, perhaps 30, a staff college graduate who had spent most of the war in headquarters positions. He had been trained to think in terms of doctrine and maneuver, not horse fodder and petroleum allocations. The collision between his theoretical planning and Seidman's practical constraints was written in his expression, confusion giving way to comprehension giving way to something that looked like despair. "What should I tell Army Group, Herr General?" the operations officer asked quietly. "Tell them we await the fuel allocations necessary to execute offensive operations," Seidman replied. "Tell them that until such allocations arrive, this division will maintain defensive positions using available resources. Tell them—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "Tell them that German soldiers can perform miracles of courage and endurance, but they cannot perform miracles of physics. Horses cannot pull artillery faster than horses can pull artillery. Trucks cannot run without fuel. These are not problems that can be solved through better leadership or stronger will. They are mathematical constraints. The meeting concluded with no decision made because no decision was possible. The offensive would not occur. The Panzer Division would remain dispersed and immobile. The infantry divisions would hold their current positions until ordered to retreat or until Soviet attacks forced withdrawal. The war would continue along lines dictated not by strategic vision but by logistical capacity, and that capacity diminished weekly. Walking back to his battery position, Weber reflected on what he'd witnessed. A German general had effectively told his staff that High Command's orders were impossible to execute, and no one had objected because everyone knew he was correct. This was new territory. Earlier in the war, when Germany was winning, objections to orders would have been unthinkable. Even when the tide turned after Stalingrad, commanders still believed that will and skill could compensate for material shortfalls. Now, in March 1944, that belief had eroded. The mathematics were too stark, the deficits too large, the trajectory too clear. April brought the Rasputitsa, the spring thaw that turned roads into rivers of mud. For horse-drawn units, this was catastrophic. Wagons sank to their axles in muck that swallowed everything. Horses struggled through mud that reached their bellies, exhausting themselves for gains measured in meters rather than kilometers. A journey that took hours on frozen ground required days through spring mud. Supply deliveries slowed to a trickle. Artillery batteries that should have maintained 3 combat loads of ammunition found themselves rationing shells, sometimes forbidden from returning fire to Soviet harassment because every round needed to be conserved for the major attack everyone knew was coming. The mechanical vehicles, those few still possessing fuel, fared little better. Half-tracks and trucks became mired in mud that no amount of engine power could overcome. Weber watched a SD, KFC, 7 sink so deep that its chassis rested on the ground, all 6 wheels spinning uselessly in liquid earth. It took 8 horses 3 hours to extract it, and when they finally succeeded, the half-track had burned through its remaining fuel in the attempt. It sat by the roadside afterward, empty and silent, a monument to immobility. On April 23, Weber received orders that crystallized the Wehrmacht's transformation from mechanized force to horse-drawn army. All artillery units were directed to permanently reorganize around horse-drawn logistics. The half-tracks and prime movers would be withdrawn to Germany for reconstitution and redeployment to priority sectors. This was high command language for "we're taking your vehicles and you won't get them back." Each battery would receive an increased allocation of horses to compensate, assuming horses could be found, which the order acknowledged might prove challenging given current procurement limitations. Weber read the directive to his battery officers. No one spoke. What was there to say? The pretense that mechanization might return, that fuel allocations would improve, that Germany would somehow regain the industrial advantage it had never truly possessed, all of that dissolved in the face of explicit orders permanently converting to horse traction. This wasn't temporary. This was the future, for however long that future lasted. How do we tell the men? His deputy, Oberleutnant Hans Kessler, asked finally. Weber considered the question. The men already knew, of course. They had been living this reality for months. The formal announcement would merely confirm what they experienced daily. We tell them the truth, he said. The Wehrmacht is reorganizing its logistics to match available resources. Horses are more reliable than vehicles we cannot fuel. We're adapting to conditions as they exist, not as we wish them to be. Will they believe that? Kessler asked. They don't need to believe it, Weber replied. They need to understand it's permanent. No more waiting for fuel that won't arrive. No more expecting the half-tracks to move again. We work with what we have. That night, he wrote another journal entry. Today the pretense ended. High Command has formally acknowledged, through reorganization orders, that Germany cannot sustain mechanized warfare. We are officially a horse-drawn army fighting enemies who measure fuel in millions of barrels. The trajectory is clear to anyone willing to see it. We cannot win a war of attrition against opponents who possess unlimited petroleum and industrial capacity. We can only delay the inevitable while the delay costs lives we cannot replace and consumes resources we cannot replenish. May brought Soviet attacks all along the front. Not the massive offensives that would come in summer, but probing attacks designed to identify weak points and force German reserves to respond. Weber's battery found itself displacing every few days, sometimes moving under fire as Soviet artillery targeted German withdrawal routes. The horses hauled the guns through continued mud, across hastily repaired bridges, along roads cratered by bombs and shells. Weber learned to read the animals like instruments measuring the army's decline. When horses collapsed in harness from exhaustion or malnutrition, when veterinary officers shook their heads over injuries that would have been treatable with proper medicine but were now death sentences, when requisition details returned empty-handed because no horses remained in stripped countryside, these were metrics of defeat more honest than any headquarters assessment. On May 14, Oberst Manstein summoned Weber to regimental headquarters. The Oberst looked older than his 48 years, the lines in his face carved deeper by stress and inadequate food. On his desk sat a thick document bound in the distinctive red cover of classified operational assessments. "I'm sending you to a division-level logistics conference," Manstein said without preamble. 19th through 21st of May at Vinnytsia. Transportation will be by truck convoy. They've allocated fuel for staff transport, apparently, though not for tactical operations. He tapped the red-covered document. "This is the agenda and supporting materials. Read it before you go. You'll understand why I want you there." Weber took the document back to his dugout and began reading. What he found was the most comprehensive acknowledgement of Germany's logistics crisis he had yet encountered. The conference was titled Alternative Logistics Solutions for Eastern Front Operations, High Command's euphemism for how to fight without fuel. The agenda included presentations on horse procurement, fodder production, veterinary care, wagon repair, and something called optimization of animal-drawn transport efficiency. The supporting materials included statistical analyses that laid bare the magnitude of Germany's situation. As of May 1, 1944, the Eastern Front possessed approximately 980,000 horses, down from 1.3 million the previous year. Monthly losses averaged 25,000 animals. Monthly replacements averaged 11,000. The projected total available horses by September 1 would be approximately 700,000, insufficient to maintain even minimal logistics for defensive operations across the front's length. The petroleum situation was equally dire. Current monthly allocations to the Eastern Front totaled 63,000 tons, approximately 40% of documented minimum requirements. Of that 63,000, the Luftwaffe consumed 18,000 for air operations. Armored and mechanized forces received 32,000, though most of that went to a few priority panzer divisions while the majority of mechanized units sat immobile. The remaining 13,000 tons had to serve every other vehicle, generator, motorcycle, and machine across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. One section of the materials addressed the question Weber knew preoccupied every field commander: could the situation improve? The analysis was brutally frank. German synthetic fuel production was unlikely to increase significantly given Allied bombing of production facilities and shortages of coal and other inputs. Romanian petroleum production was declining as fields were depleted and Soviet forces advanced toward the oil regions. Captured Soviet fuel stocks had dried up as the Red Army learned to destroy supplies during retreats. Hungarian and Austrian petroleum contributions were negligible. The conclusion, buried in bureaucratic language but unmistakable in meaning: current projections indicate petroleum allocations to Eastern Front forces will continue declining through calendar year 1944 and into 1945. All planning should proceed from the assumption that mechanized operations will become increasingly limited to specific offensive actions by concentrated armored formations, while routine logistics and tactical movement will depend primarily on horse-drawn and manual transport. Weber read that paragraph 3 times. High Command was telling its officers that Germany would spend the remainder of the war, however long that proved to be, fighting with logistics inferior to those of 1918. The Blitzkrieg was over. The mechanized Wehrmacht of propaganda films had become a horse-drawn army of physical reality, and this transformation was permanent. The conference at Vinnitsa confirmed everything the documents suggested. Weber sat among 200 officers, battery commanders, regimental logistics officers, division quartermasters, and listened to presentations that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. A veterinary colonel lectured on preventing equine disease through improved stable hygiene. A logistics major demonstrated new wagon designs that distributed weight more efficiently. An agricultural specialist explained how to identify grazing lands suitable for horses in Ukraine's depleted countryside. The presentations were professional, thorough, and deeply depressing. These were capable officers applying their expertise to problems that shouldn't exist in a modern army. They were optimizing horse-drawn logistics with the same analytical rigor that should have been applied to mechanized warfare. The entire conference felt like a funeral for modernity conducted with perfect military bearing. On the conference's second day, General Oberst Ferdinand Schorner addressed the assembled officers. Schorner commanded Army Group South Ukraine and had a reputation for ruthless competence. He spoke bluntly, without the euphemisms that characterized most high-command communications. "Gentlemen, you are here because the German army is no longer the force we believed we commanded," Schorner began. "We entered this war with confidence in our technological and tactical superiority. We achieved remarkable victories through mechanized maneuver and concentrated force. Those days are over. We now fight an enemy that possesses greater industrial capacity, more petroleum, and unlimited manpower. We cannot match them vehicle for vehicle, tank for tank, or leader for leader. We can only delay their advance through superior tactics and the courage of our soldiers." He paused, letting that sink in. "Your mission is to make horse-drawn logistics work not because it is optimal, but because it is all we have. The fuel you requisition will not arrive. The vehicles you request will not be delivered. The petroleum allocations you need to execute mobile operations do not exist. These are facts, not criticisms. Adapt to them or fail." Weber looked around the room. Faces showed resignation, frustration, sometimes anger, but no surprise. Every officer present had lived this reality for months. Schorner was simply speaking aloud what everyone already knew. "There will be no dramatic reversal," Schorner continued. "No secret weapons, no new alliances, no miraculous fuel discoveries. The trajectory is established. Our task is to exact the highest possible price for every kilometer we yield. Horse-drawn artillery is slower than mechanized artillery, but it can still kill Soviet tanks. Infantry on foot is less mobile than motorized infantry, but it can still hold defensive positions. We work with what we possess, not what we wish we possessed." That evening, Weber sat with a group of officers in a commandeered building, drinking the ersatz coffee that had replaced actual coffee months ago. The conversation turned, inevitably, to the question no one wanted to ask directly: how long? The question no one wanted to ask directly: how long? "The Soviets will launch their summer offensive within weeks," said a major from an infantry division. "When it comes, we won't have the mobility to respond. We'll be fixed in place while they maneuver around us. Berlin still talks about reserves," offered a captain from a panzer division. "Divisions being refitted in Germany, new formations being organized." The major laughed bitterly. "With what fuel will these divisions operate? With what trucks will they move? High Command can create new divisions on paper, but they cannot create petroleum or vehicles from nothing." Weber spoke quietly. "I read a classified assessment last month. It projected total logistics collapse by spring 1945 at current attrition rates. That assumes the front remains relatively static. If the Soviets break through, when they break through, the collapse accelerates." Silence. Then the captain asked, "Did the assessment offer any solutions?" "No," Weber replied. "It simply documented the problem and suggested commanders plan accordingly." "Plan for what?" the major asked. "Plan to lose slowly instead of quickly?" No one had an answer to that. The Soviet summer offensive came on June 23, 1944, Operation Bagration, though Weber wouldn't learn that name until much later. It struck Army Group Center with overwhelming force, over 2.3 million Soviet troops, 36,000 artillery pieces, and 5,000 tanks supported by 6,000 aircraft. Against this, German forces could muster perhaps 800,000 men, many in divisions depleted by months of attrition, supplied by logistics that had already reached breaking point before the offensive began. Weber's battery sat 70 kilometers south of the main assault, but the shock waves reached them within hours. Desperate orders arrived directing all available reserves north to stem the breakthrough. The reserves didn't exist. The few mechanized units that still possessed fuel were already committed. Infantry divisions ordered to march north discovered they couldn't, not at the speed required, not across distances that mechanized forces would have covered in hours but that foot soldiers required days to traverse. The horse-drawn artillery units faced an impossible calculus. Moving the guns required horses. The horses required fodder. Fodder required wagons. Wagons required more horses. The entire system consumed itself trying to achieve mobility that remained perpetually insufficient. Weber's battery received orders to displace 40 kilometers north on June 25. The movement took 3 days. By the time they arrived at their designated position, the front had moved another 60 kilometers west. They were chasing a battle they could never catch because the speed of horse-drawn warfare could not match the tempo of Soviet mechanized assault. On June 29, Weber stood beside Oberst Manstein watching the horizon burn. Somewhere to the north, beyond their vision but undeniable in its magnitude, German positions were collapsing. The roads behind them filled with retreating units, infantry trudging west in ragged columns, wagons piled with wounded, the occasional vehicle limping along on fumes or being towed by horses. The Wehrmacht was coming apart not through lack of courage but through mathematics, too much front, too few soldiers, and logistics that moved at walking speed while the enemy maneuvered at highway speed. "They've broken through at Vitebsk and Bobruisk," Manstein said quietly, reading from a fragmentary radio report. 3 German armies are encircled or in danger of encirclement. Army Group Center is requesting immediate mechanized reserves to stabilize the situation. He lowered the paper. Reserves that don't exist. Mechanized forces that cannot move. The request might as well ask for the moon. Weber said nothing. What was there to say? They both understood what was happening. The Soviet offensive had identified and exploited Germany's fundamental weakness. An army that could not maneuver was an army that could be destroyed piecemeal. Fixed in place by fuel shortages and horse-drawn logistics, German units became targets for Soviet artillery and aviation. Units ordered to retreat discovered they couldn't move fast enough to escape encirclement. Units ordered to counterattack found they couldn't concentrate quickly enough to achieve local superiority. The battle was being lost in supply depots and fodder stores as much as on firing lines. Soviet forces advanced faster than German logistics could retreat. Ammunition dumps were abandoned because there weren't enough wagons to evacuate them. Artillery pieces were destroyed in place because horses had died and no replacements existed. Wounded were left behind because there weren't enough vehicles to carry them and walking wounded couldn't keep pace with the retreat. On July 4, Weber's battery received the order every commander dreaded: destroy all equipment that cannot be evacuated, retreat immediately on available transport. The half-tracks had been gone for months. The horses numbered 32, 16 had died or been lost in the previous week's chaos. 32 horses could pull perhaps 4 guns and a few ammunition wagons. Weber commanded 6 guns. He made the decision with mechanical efficiency, refusing to let himself feel what it meant. 2 guns would be evacuated intact. 4 would be destroyed. They removed the breech blocks from the condemned guns, smashed the sights with sledgehammers, and prepared demolition charges. The charges were detonated at dusk, 4 precise explosions that reduced German artillery pieces to twisted metal. Weber watched, thinking about the factories that had built those guns, the workers who had crafted them, the resources that had gone into their production. All of it now scrapped because Germany couldn't provide the horses to pull them west. The retreat became a running nightmare. 32 horses pulling guns and wagons, moving when possible at night to avoid Soviet aircraft, hiding by day in whatever cover could be found. The animals weakened daily on insufficient fodder and overwork. Men ate even less, dividing their rations to provide extra feed for horses because without the horses, nothing moved. Weber watched as battery transformed from a military unit into a refugee column, discipline fraying as exhaustion and hunger eroded everything except the simple imperative to survive. They moved west through a landscape of defeat. Burned vehicles lined the roads, German trucks and tanks and half-tracks abandoned and destroyed to prevent capture. The mechanized Wehrmacht, or what remained of it, was dying in place for lack of fuel. The propaganda that had shown endless columns of panzers and half-tracks was being replaced by reality, endless columns of men on foot and horses in harness, moving too slowly to escape an enemy that possessed everything Germany lacked. On July 17, the battery's remaining horses began collapsing from exhaustion and malnutrition. First one, struggling to pull its load up a hill, simply stopped and couldn't be coaxed forward. It died in harness. Then another the following day. Then 3 in a single night. The mathematics became brutal, fewer horses meant abandoning more equipment. Abandon equipment and you could move faster, but you lost combat power. Keep equipment and you moved slower, making it easier for Soviet forces to catch you. Weber made the decision in stages, each abandonment a small death. First the ammunition wagons, keep only what the guns could carry. Then one of the 2 remaining guns, concentrate the remaining horses on pulling a single piece. Then personal equipment, everything except weapons and minimal food. The battery that had begun the war as a modern, mechanized force had been reduced to men, 1 gun, and 16 dying horses. They crossed into Poland on August 3, 97 days after the Soviet offensive began. Of Weber's original battery of 120 men, 43 remained. 1 gun instead of 6. 16 horses instead of 48. They had killed perhaps a dozen Soviet tanks and infantry carriers during the retreat. The Soviets had destroyed an entire German army group, capturing or killing 300,000 German soldiers, and advanced 600 kilometers in 2 months. The horses had limited German mobility to the point where maneuver warfare became impossible. The fuel crisis had transformed the Wehrmacht into a force that could defend fixed positions but couldn't respond to breakthroughs, couldn't counterattack effectively, couldn't retreat quickly enough to avoid encirclement. In September, Weber attended another logistics conference, this one hastily organized as Army Group Center attempted to reconstitute from its summer catastrophe. The agenda focused on lessons learned from the retreat, though Weber suspected the real lesson was too painful for official acknowledgement. Nevertheless, the presentations were brutally honest in ways that would have been impossible earlier in the war. A colonel from 4th Army described his division's retreat in statistical terms. The division had begun the Soviet offensive with 3,000 horses. It ended with 470. Horse losses exceeded 90%. Artillery and supply units had been forced to abandon 70% of their equipment. The division's combat effectiveness, rated at 60% before the offensive, now stood at 15%. And that 15% assumes we receive replacements, horses, men, and equipment, that we have no reason to believe will arrive, the colonel concluded. Another officer, a logistics major, presented an analysis of horse attrition causes during the retreat. 40% died from overwork and exhaustion. 25% from malnutrition and disease. 20% from combat action, artillery, airstrikes, or simply being caught in crossfire. 15% from injuries sustained during movement, broken legs, lacerations, infections that couldn't be treated with depleted medical supplies. The major's conclusion was stark: horse-drawn logistics cannot sustain the tempo of modern mobile warfare. Animals that require rest, food, and veterinary care cannot match the operational speed of mechanized forces. The fundamental mismatch between our logistics capability and enemy operational tempo was the primary factor in our inability to conduct effective mobile defense. Weber listened to presentation after presentation documenting what he had lived. The conferences, the reports, the statistical analyses, all of it amounted to High Command systematically documenting how Germany had lost the war through logistics. Not through lack of courage or tactical skill, but through simple mathematics. Germany entered an industrial war without the industrial resources to sustain it, and petroleum, more than any other single factor, determined the outcome. A general major from OKH delivered the closing address. His words stayed with Weber long after the conference ended. "Gentlemen, we have spent 3 days discussing horse procurement, fodder supplies, and wagon maintenance. These are 19th century solutions to 21st century problems. Our enemies fight with unlimited petroleum, aircraft, and trucks. We fight with horses that die faster than we can replace them. This mismatch is not temporary. It is structural and irreversible given our resource base and industrial capacity." The general paused, surveying the room. "Some of you may wonder why we continue if the situation is hopeless. The answer is that politics, not logistics, determines when wars end. Our task is to impose the maximum cost on Soviet advances, buying time for whatever resolution may come. But make no mistake, we are not delaying defeat. We are determining its speed and character. The horses you manage, the wagons you maintain, the fodder you procure, these determine how many days or weeks we can delay the inevitable, nothing more." No one applauded. The room emptied in silence. By October, Weber had been reassigned to a reconstituted artillery regiment forming in East Prussia. The unit received 6 guns, 42 horses, and orders to prepare defensive positions against the expected Soviet winter offensive. The horses were old, requisitioned from farms in East Prussia that could ill afford to lose them. The men were teenagers and overage reservists. The ammunition allocation was 60% of doctrinal requirements. The fuel allocation for support vehicles was listed as pending. Everyone understood that meant 0. Weber trained his new battery with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had accepted reality. They would hold their positions as long as possible. They would retreat when ordered or when Soviet forces made staying impossible. They would fight with what they had because nothing else was coming. The propaganda still played in cinemas, showing German forces counterattacking with panzers and half-tracks. Weber and his men lived in a different war, one measured in hoof prints and hay rations and wounded horses that had to be shot because veterinary medicine was reserved for animals that still had value. In November, a package arrived from Oberst Manstein, now commanding a regiment farther south. It contained a letter and a copy of a classified report from OKW titled Strategic Assessment of Petroleum Availability and Military Operations, 1945 Projections. Manstein's letter was brief. "Read this. Understand that High Command knows exactly what I told you last February. They know, and they continue anyway. I no longer understand why, but I continue to follow orders because the alternative is unthinkable. Perhaps you have better answers than I do." The report was comprehensive, clinical, and devastating. It projected that Germany's total petroleum availability in 1945 would decline to approximately 4 million tons annually, half the 1944 allocation. Of that, the Luftwaffe would consume 50% merely to maintain minimal defensive operations. The Kriegsmarine would need another 20%. That left 30%, roughly 1.2 million tons, for the entire German army operating on multiple fronts. The report calculated that maintaining even defensive operations required approximately 3 million tons annually. The deficit was unbridgeable. The conclusion, stated with bureaucratic understatement, noted, continued military operations in 1945 will require progressive reduction in mechanized forces and increased reliance on non-petroleum-dependent transport and tactical methods. Weber understood what that meant. Germany would spend 1945 retreating on foot and hoof while its enemies advanced on treads and wheels. The war would end not through climactic battles but through simple exhaustion, Germany running out of fuel, horses, men, and space, in that order. He wrote a final journal entry that November, knowing he might not survive to read it but needing to document what he had witnessed. The war was lost when we invaded the Soviet Union with logistics sufficient for 6 months and a strategic plan that required 6 years. It was lost when we built panzers we couldn't fuel and half-tracks we couldn't maintain. It was lost when we believed that will and courage could substitute for petroleum and industrial capacity. The horses pulling our artillery through snow are not a temporary setback. They are the physical manifestation of Germany's defeat, a visual representation of the gap between propaganda and reality, between what we claim to be and what we actually were. Every horse that dies in harness, every gun abandoned for lack of transport, every kilometer we retreat because we cannot maneuver, these are the arithmetic of defeat written in blood and exhaustion. High Command knows this. They document it in classified reports and logistics assessments. But they continue ordering advances we cannot execute and defenses we cannot sustain because admitting impossibility would require admitting the war is lost. So we continue, feeding horses and men into the mathematics of attrition, until the mathematics run out. The Soviet winter offensive came in January 1945. Weber's battery fired its last shells on January 16, expended its remaining horses on January 18 in a retreat that failed to outpace Soviet armor, and ceased to exist as an organized unit on January 19 when Soviet tanks overran their position during a snowstorm. Weber survived by chance. Separated from his unit during the chaos, he attached himself to an infantry column retreating west and eventually reached German lines. He spent the war's final months assigned to various ad hoc units as the German army disintegrated. He saw the same pattern everywhere: horse-drawn units immobilized by lack of fodder, mechanized units immobilized by lack of fuel, infantry units immobilized by exhaustion. The Wehrmacht had become a static force defending shrinking territory against enemies who possessed unlimited mobility. The outcome was never in doubt. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Weber was captured by American forces on May 5 near the Elbe River. He spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp, where he had time to reflect on what he'd witnessed. Other prisoners, especially younger soldiers who had joined late in the war, sometimes expressed bitterness that Germany had lost despite possessing superior tanks and training. Weber would explain, patiently, that tanks without fuel were sculptures, that training without logistics was performance art, that wars were won by the side that could deliver bullets to firing lines and food to soldiers, not by the side with better propaganda. After his release in 1947, Weber returned to civilian life and never spoke publicly about his experiences. His journal survived the war, discovered decades later among his effects. His observations about logistics and the fuel crisis were later confirmed by captured German documents, the classified reports he had read, the conference minutes he had attended, the statistical assessments documenting Germany's decline. Historians examining Germany's defeat have identified many factors: strategic overreach, tactical errors, ideological fanaticism, enemy industrial superiority. But underneath all of these lay a simple truth that Weber had learned watching horses die in harness: Germany entered an industrial war without the industrial resources to sustain it. The mechanized Wehrmacht of propaganda existed primarily in films and photographs. The actual Wehrmacht, the one that fought and lost, moved increasingly on foot and hoof as petroleum shortages reduced mechanized warfare to an occasional luxury rather than the operational norm. The horses that pulled artillery through snow in 1944 weren't a failure of planning or a temporary setback. They were the truth that propaganda couldn't conceal and that no amount of courage could overcome. They were the physical proof that Germany had lost the war the moment it began, because the mathematics of petroleum and steel always override the narratives of will and spirit, and Germany possessed neither the petroleum nor the steel to match enemies who had both in unlimited quantities. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.